On September 7th, 1566, 600 wounded Croatian soldiers made a decision that defies all military logic. Instead of surrendering to 100,000 Ottoman troops, they turned their burning fortress into history's largest bomb and voluntarily stayed inside to detonate it. Picture this moment frozen in time. The Ottoman army, victorious after a month-long siege, streams through the shattered gates of Szigetvár fortress. Their banners flutter in triumph. Their war cries echo across the Hungarian marshlands. They've finally broken the stubborn Croatian resistance that cost them thousands of lives. But something's wrong. The defenders aren't fleeing. They're not surrendering. Instead, 600 blood-soaked Croatian soldiers stand in perfect formation in the courtyard, their commander, Count Nikola Zrinski, at their head, dressed in his finest silk uniform, with a purse of gold coins sewn into his collar, payment for whoever would bury him. In exactly 7 seconds, this scene of Ottoman victory will transform into one of history's most devastating tactical surprises. The very stones beneath their feet will become weapons. The fortress itself will cease to exist, and with it, 3,000 Ottoman soldiers will simply vanish. 1 month earlier, this same fortress stood as the last barrier between the Ottoman Empire's massive invasion force and the heart of Christian Europe. The numbers were impossible. 2,300 Croatian defenders against over 100,000 Ottoman soldiers and 300 siege cannons. Military logic said they should last 3 days, maybe 5. They lasted 32. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. The defenders had 3 chances to surrender with honor. They had permission to retreat. They even had a relief army just 50 miles away. Yet they chose something else entirely, to transform their defeat into a weapon that would echo through centuries. How did they hide tons of gunpowder from an occupying army? Why did the Habsburg Empire abandon its most loyal defenders? What drove Count Zrinski to choreograph not just his own death, but an apocalypse that would change European history forever? To understand how 600 men orchestrated their own annihilation to save a civilization, we need to understand the world they were trying to save. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most devastating last stands, hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see medieval warfare forever. Now, let me take you back to the swamplands of Hungary where the fate of Europe hung in the balance. The year 1566 marked a critical moment in the centuries-old struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the man who had transformed the Ottomans from a regional power into a global empire, was 72 years old and leading what would be his final campaign. For 46 years, his armies had swept across 3 continents, conquering Belgrade, Rhodes, most of Hungary, and reaching the gates of Vienna itself. But Suleiman had a problem. Despite his vast empire stretching from Baghdad to Budapest, one small Croatian count kept disrupting his European ambitions. Count Nikola Šubić Zrinski wasn't just another nobleman. He was a military genius who had turned a swampy fortress in southern Hungary into a knife pointed at the Ottoman supply lines. Szigetvár wasn't much to look at. Built on an island surrounded by marshland, connected to dry land by a single causeway, it seemed more prison than fortress. Yet its strategic position made it invaluable. Any Ottoman army marching toward Vienna had to pass within striking distance. Zrinski had used this advantage ruthlessly, launching raids that destroyed supply convoys and scattered Ottoman forces. The Habsburg Emperor, Maximilian II, should have reinforced this vital position. He had 80,000 troops within marching distance. Instead, he chose to wait, hoping the Ottomans and Croatians would exhaust each other. This cold calculation would cost thousands of lives and nearly doom Christian Europe. Meanwhile, Suleiman assembled the largest invasion force of his reign. Contemporary accounts describe an army that took 3 days to pass a single point, 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers, including the elite Janissary Corps, supported by 300 siege cannons. Each cannon required a team of oxen to move and could hurl stone balls weighing up to 300 pounds. The logistics alone was staggering. This army consumed supplies equivalent to a medium-sized city every single day. But here's where it gets interesting. Suleiman wasn't supposed to be leading this campaign at all. His advisors had begged him to stay in Istanbul. The Sultan was dying, though this was a closely guarded secret. Gout had crippled his legs, dysentery racked his body. He could barely sit on his horse and had to be carried in a litter for most of the journey. Yet he came anyway. Why? Because Zrinski had made it personal. The Croatian count had rejected multiple offers of governorship from the Ottomans. He'd humiliated Ottoman commanders in battle. Most importantly, He'd sworn a sacred oath to defend Christianity that meant more to him than life itself. Zrinski knew what was coming. As the Ottoman host approached, he gathered his 2,300 defenders, mostly Croatian soldiers mixed with local Hungarian civilians who refused to flee. He burned every building outside the fortress walls, poisoned the wells, and turned the surrounding countryside into a wasteland. Then he did something that would define the siege. He sent away anyone who wanted to leave, keeping only those willing to die. His final message to the Habsburg Emperor was prophetic. "I will hold Szigetvár as long as I live. What happens after is in God's hands." The defenders spent their last peaceful nights transforming their fortress. What the Ottomans didn't know was that Zrinski wasn't just preparing defenses. Hidden in cellars and tunnels throughout the fortress, his men were positioning thousands of pounds of gunpowder in a pattern that would turn the entire structure into history's largest improvised explosive device. But why would the greatest sultan in Ottoman history divert his entire army to crush one stubborn Croatian? On August 5th, 1566, the earth itself began to shake. Scouts on Szigetvár's walls felt it first, a rhythmic tremor that grew stronger by the hour. Then came the dust cloud, rising like a brown mountain on the horizon. The Ottoman host had arrived. What approached Szigetvár defied comprehension. The Sultan's army moved like a city across the landscape. At its heart marched 12,000 janissaries, the elite infantry that had never lost a major battle. These weren't conscripts but professional soldiers, taken as children and trained for decades in the arts of war. Each carried an early firearm, the arquebus, along with the curved sword that had become their trademark. Behind them came the Sipahi cavalry, 40,000 horsemen whose ancestors had swept out of the Asian steppes. The artillery train stretched for miles, 300 siege cannons, including massive bombards that required 60 oxen each to move. The largest, named Great Gun, could fire stone balls weighing 800 pounds. Military engineers had calculated that just 1 week of bombardment from this artillery would level any fortress in Europe. But here's what the Ottomans didn't know. The 2,300 defenders weren't typical garrison troops. Zrinski had handpicked his men over years of border warfare. These were veterans who had spent their lives fighting Turkish raiders, men who knew every trick of siege warfare. More importantly, they were almost all Croatian soldiers who shared their commander's fanatical determination to protect their homeland. The fortress itself had been transformed into a death trap. Szigetvár consisted of 3 sections: the new town, the old town, and the inner castle. Each was separated by water and connected by narrow bridges that could be destroyed in minutes. The Croatians had spent months preparing. Every approach was pre-targeted by cannon. Every wall had fallback positions. Every building that couldn't be defended had been rigged to burn or collapse. Then Zrinski did something unexpected. As the Ottoman army deployed, he ordered his cannons to fire a salute, not at the enemy, but into the air. It was a message: "We see you, we're not afraid, and we're ready to die." The psychological impact rippled through the Ottoman ranks. These defenders weren't cowering behind their walls. The Sultan's war council convened that first night. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha argued for bypassing Szigetvár entirely. Why waste time on this minor fortress when Vienna beckoned? But Suleiman, barely able to stand, slammed his fist on the table. "No Turkish army bypasses an enemy fortress," he declared. "We take Szigetvár, or we return in shame." What his generals didn't know was that Suleiman could barely return at all. The Sultan's physician later wrote that his master was dying by the hour. His insistence on taking Szigetvár wasn't strategy. It was the pride of a dying emperor who refused to let a Croatian count mar his final campaign. The numbers told a stark story. The Ottomans had a 50-1 advantage in men. Their artillery outgunned the defenders 15-1. They had unlimited supplies, while the Croatians had food for perhaps 6 weeks. By every military calculation, Szigetvár should fall within days. But castles in marshland follow different rules. The soft ground would absorb cannon impacts. The water barriers prevented mass assaults. The single causeway approaching the fortress became a killing field, where Ottoman numerical superiority meant nothing. Geography had given Zrinski one precious advantage. The enemy could only attack from one direction. As dawn broke on August 6th, the Sultan ordered the bombardment to begin. 300 cannons opened fire simultaneously, a thunder that could be heard 20 miles away. The Croatian defenders huddled in their positions as stone balls rained down like meteors. Buildings exploded, walls cracked, the very air seemed to vibrate with violence. But then something strange happened. After the initial shock wore off, the defenders began to count the rhythm of the bombardment. They learned which positions were safe during reloading. They discovered that the marsh absorbed much of the impact. Most importantly, they realized that their enemy's greatest strength, those mighty cannons, were slowly sinking into the soft ground. Zrinski gathered his lieutenants that first night. Surrounded by the crash of artillery, he laid out a plan that defied military convention. They wouldn't just defend, they would attack. They would make the Ottomans pay in blood for every yard. And when the end came, they had one final card to play. On August 5th, 1566, the earth itself began to shake. Day 1 through 5, the Ottoman cannons had turned the new town into hell itself. Every hour, over 1,000 cannonballs slammed into the Croatian defenses. The mathematics of destruction were simple. Each impact removed pounds of stone and mortar. The walls, built to withstand medieval catapults, crumbled like sandcastles before modern artillery. But the Croatians had learned to read the rhythm of death. Count Zrinski ordered his men to dig, connecting tunnels between positions. When Ottoman spotters saw movement in one section, the cannons would concentrate there, only to find the defenders had already shifted to safety underground. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse played with 300-pound stone balls. What happened next defied all military logic. On the night of August 9th, as Ottoman engineers prepared for the first infantry assault, 200 Croatian soldiers slipped out of the fortress. Moving through the marsh like ghosts, they reached the Ottoman artillery positions. In 20 minutes of savage hand-to-hand combat, they spiked dozens of cannons with iron nails, killed the gun crews, and vanished back into the swamp before the alarm could be raised. The first major Ottoman assault came at dawn on August 10th. 8,000 Janissaries advanced across the causeway toward the new town's battered walls. They expected token resistance from demoralized defenders. Instead, they walked into a masterpiece of defensive warfare. Zrinski had hidden his best marksmen in the rubble with early rifles called arquebus. As the Janissaries massed for their charge, concentrated fire tore through their ranks. When they finally reached the walls, they found not the expected breaches, but a second wall built from earth-filled barrels and wagon wheels. Croatian soldiers appeared from hidden positions, raining down stones, boiling water, and primitive grenades. But here's where it gets insane. The swamp itself joined the battle. Ottoman soldiers who tried to flank the causeway found themselves sinking in mud that could swallow a man to his chest. Those who fell wounded drowned in inches of water. The marsh became a graveyard, where armored men simply disappeared. The assault lasted 6 hours. When the Janissaries finally retreated, they left 3,000 dead in the marsh and on the causeway. The Croatian losses, 50 men. The kill ratio was so lopsided that Sultan Suleiman accused his commanders of cowardice. He ordered the executions of several officers to restore discipline. But then the Ottomans did something that changed everything. They killed the swamp itself. Starting on August 15th, 30,000 workers began one of the most ambitious engineering projects in siege history. Working day and night under Croatian sniper fire, they built a massive series of dams and channels to drain the marsh. Cart by cart, they hauled in earth and stones to create solid ground for their artillery and troops. Here's the detail that changes everything. As the water levels dropped, Croatian scouts made a horrifying discovery. The Ottomans weren't just draining the marsh. They were building a network of covered trenches that would allow them to reach the walls protected from defensive fire. Modern archaeologists have found these trenches extended over 2 miles, a subterranean highway of death approaching the fortress. Days 16 through 20 saw the new town's final agony. With solid ground beneath their cannons, the Ottoman artillery could finally deploy their full power. The massive bombard, called Great Gun, fired shots that could demolish entire buildings. One cannonball killed 12 defenders in a single impact, painting the walls with blood and brain matter. But Zrinski had one more card to play. On August 19th, he ordered the new town evacuated and set on fire. But this wasn't a simple retreat. Croatian engineers had spent days placing combustible materials in specific patterns. When the flames reached hidden gunpowder charges, entire sections of the town exploded outward, catching Ottoman assault troops in a firestorm that killed hundreds. The psychological warfare intensified. Zrinski had his men mount the heads of killed Janissaries on pikes along the walls. When Ottoman negotiators approached under a flag of truce, offering safe passage if the garrison surrendered, Zrinski's response was to fire a cannon directly at them, a massive breach of military protocol that sent a clear message: No quarter would be asked or given. By August 25th, the situation map looked grim. The new town was gone. Ottoman trenches reached within 50 yards of the old town walls. The defenders' casualties had mounted to 800 dead, over a third of their force. Food supplies were running low, medicine was exhausted, and the nearest Habsburg relief force remained motionless 50 miles away. What the Ottomans didn't realize was that every yard they advanced brought them deeper into Zrinski's trap. The Croatian commander had been studying their attack patterns, noting where troops concentrated, mapping their supply routes. In the tunnels beneath the old town, his engineers worked by candlelight, connecting gunpowder charges in a pattern that would turn the entire fortress into a massive shaped charge. As August turned to September, both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the final phase. The Sultan, now so ill he could barely leave his tent, demanded the fortress fall before the month's end. His commanders, seeing their master dying, pushed their troops to suicidal attacks. On August 5th, 1566, the earth itself began to shake. The new town's death came in stages, each more horrific than the last. By August 11th, Ottoman artillery had created 3 major breaches in the outer walls. But Zrinski had anticipated this. Behind each breach, his men had constructed a killing field, a maze of sharpened stakes, concealed pits, and interlocking fields of fire from hidden positions. The second major assault came on August 14th. This time, the Ottomans sent 12,000 men in coordinated waves. The first wave carried massive shields and fascines, bundles of wood to fill the defensive ditches. The second wave brought scaling ladders. The third consisted of elite janissaries meant to exploit any breakthrough. What followed wasn't a battle, but an apocalypse. Croatian defenders had prepared barrels of pitch and sulfur that created toxic smoke. Men fought blind in the choking fumes. The Ottoman dead piled so high they formed ramps for the next wave of attackers. At one breach, a Croatian soldier named Juraj Kabila held his position alone for 20 minutes, killing 17 attackers before a Turkish arrow found his eye. But the mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Each Croatian death meant one less defender. Each Ottoman death meant nothing to an army of 100,000. By nightfall, on August 17th, Zrinski made the hardest decision of the siege. The new town couldn't hold another day. But rather than simply abandon it, he would turn retreat into weapon. The evacuation began at midnight. Women and children went first, carrying what supplies they could. The wounded followed, some crawling on hands and knees. Last came the fighting men, backing away step by step, making the Ottomans pay for every yard. As the final defenders crossed the bridge to Old Town, Croatian engineers lit the fuses. The new town didn't just burn, it exploded in sections. Each blast calculated to catch Ottoman troops moving in to occupy it. The old town was Szigetvar's heart, a fortified island connected to the inner castle by a single wooden bridge. Its walls were thicker, its position stronger, but it now held all the surviving defenders and civilians. 1,500 people crammed into a space meant for 500. But here's what the Ottomans didn't know. The old town had been transformed into a fortress within a fortress. Every house had become a bunker. Every street was blocked with improvised barricades. The Croatians had learned from the new town's fall. This time, they wouldn't try to hold walls. They would make the enemy fight for every building, every room, every staircase. The Ottoman response was to unleash hell. Starting August 20th, they fired incendiary shells, hollow iron balls filled with combustible materials. The old town became an inferno. Civilians formed bucket brigades while soldiers fought. Children as young as 10 carried ammunition to the walls. The priest, Father Trunco, blessed weapons between firefighting efforts. Then came the mining war. Ottoman engineers, protected by mobile shields, began digging tunnels under the old town walls. The defenders could hear them, the scratch of picks, the whisper of dirt being moved. Zrinski ordered countermines dug. Deep beneath Szigetvar, a second battle raged in absolute darkness. Men fought with knives in tunnels so tight they couldn't swing swords. Sometimes the only warning was the sound of breathing before someone died. On August 29th, the Ottomans detonated their first mine. The explosion tore a 30-foot gap in the old town's eastern wall. Through the smoke and dust came 5,000 janissaries in the most concentrated assault yet. They expected to pour through into a stunned defense. Instead, they found Zrinski himself, standing in the breach with his personal guard. The Croatian count, now wounded in 3 places, fought with the fury of a man who had accepted death. For 4 hours, the breach became a meat grinder. bodies piled so high that attackers had to climb over their own dead. When the Janissaries finally retreated, they left 2,000 corpses. The breach was sealed with their bodies. By September 1st, the old town was unrecognizable. Continuous bombardment had reduced most buildings to rubble. The defenders fought from crater to crater, like a preview of World War I. The stench of death was so overwhelming that both sides wore cloth masks soaked in vinegar. But then something happened that nobody expected. Sultan Suleiman, watching from his command tent, suddenly collapsed. His guards quickly surrounded him, blocking the view from other officers. For 3 hours, the Ottoman assault continued, while their supreme commander lay dying. Only the Grand Vizier and the Sultan's physician knew the truth. What followed was one of history's great deceptions. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha made a desperate decision. The army couldn't know their Sultan was dead. It would destroy morale and might cause the entire campaign to collapse. They dressed Suleiman's corpse in his armor, propped him up in his tent where he could be glimpsed from a distance, and issued orders in his name. Meanwhile, the siege reached new levels of savagery. Croatian women joined the fighting, pouring boiling water mixed with quicklime on attackers. One widow, Kata Patarika, killed 6 Ottomans with a cooking pot before being cut down. Children loaded weapons and tended the wounded. The old town's hospital, crammed into a church basement, became a chamber of horrors where the priest performed last rites assembly line style. This is where the story takes a dark turn. On September 4th, Zrinski received a final message from the Habsburg Emperor. The relief army would not come. Maximilian had decided that sacrificing Szigetvár would weaken both Ottomans and Croatians, making his own position stronger. The defenders were officially abandoned. The final days blurred into one continuous battle. The Ottomans no longer paused between assaults. Fresh troops replaced exhausted ones in a constant rotation. The Croatian defenders, now fewer than 800 capable of fighting, couldn't rest. Men fought until they collapsed, slept where they fell, then rose to fight again. September 2nd saw the old town's water supply fail. Ottoman artillery had deliberately targeted the wells and cisterns. The defenders were reduced to drinking wine mixed with vinegar. The wounded, desperate with thirst, licked blood from the stones, but Zrinski was preparing his masterpiece. In the tunnels beneath the inner castle, Croatian engineers had placed 3,000 pounds of gunpowder in a specific pattern, not randomly, but positioned to channel the blast upward and outward, turning the entire fortress into a massive claymore mine. The fuses were cut to different lengths, ensuring the explosions would cascade in sequence for maximum devastation. Here's what made this different from every other siege. The defenders weren't trying to survive anymore. They were choreographing their death for maximum impact. Every Croatian soldier was told the plan. None deserted. They would make their last stand in the inner castle, draw in as many Ottomans as possible, then ignite their funeral pyre. By September 5th, only the inner castle remained in Croatian hands. The old town was a smoking ruin occupied by Ottoman troops. The defenders numbered fewer than 600 men capable of bearing arms. Many were wounded multiple times. They had no food, no water, no medicine, no hope of relief. That night, Count Zrinski gathered his men for confession. Father Chunko, himself wounded, heard the sins of men about to die. They prayed not for salvation but for the strength to take as many enemies with them as possible. Zrinski dressed in his finest clothes, silk doublet, gold chains, his sword polished to mirror brightness. He had gold coins sewn into his collar with a note, "For whoever buries Count Zrinski with honor." September 6th dawned blood-red through the smoke of burning Szigetvár. The Ottoman army prepared for the final assault that would end this embarrassing siege. 20,000 fresh troops massed for the attack. Their commanders promised rich rewards for the first men into the inner castle. They didn't know they were being invited to their own funeral. Zrinski made his final preparations with calm precision. He ordered all remaining gunpowder brought to the designated points. The wounded, who couldn't walk, were given positions near the powder stores with lit torches. They would be the triggermen. Every man understood. When the Ottomans breached the inner castle, they would wait until the maximum number were inside, then light the fuses. But fate had other plans. That morning, a Hungarian turncoat in Ottoman service recognized the preparations. He'd seen similar tactics in mining operations. He tried to warn the Turkish commanders that something was wrong, that the defenders' behavior suggested a trap. His warnings were dismissed. After all, what could 600 exhausted men do against 20,000? The final Ottoman assault began at noon. This wasn't the careful, coordinated attack of professional soldiers. This was a race for plunder. The inner castle's gates, mysteriously, seemed weaker than expected. They gave way after just an hour of bombardment. Ottoman troops poured through, eager to be first to the loot. What happened next is still debated. Some accounts say Zrinski waited until 3,000 Ottomans were inside before giving the signal. Others claim he intended to wait longer, but was mortally wounded and gave the order early. What's certain is that at approximately 3:47 p.m. on September 7th, 1566, Count Nikola Zrinski raised his sword one last time and shouted a single word that would echo through history. Now, as dawn broke on September 7th, Zrinski gathered his last 600 men for a speech that would echo through eternity. Count Nikola Zrinski stood before his 600 remaining men in the inner courtyard. His words, recorded by the siege's only Christian survivor, remain one of history's greatest battlefield speeches. Brothers, you see how our fortress burns, how our walls have fallen, how death surrounds us. The emperor has abandoned us. No relief will come, but we are Croatians. We do not beg for mercy from those who know none. Today, we write our names in eternity. Our bodies will die, but our sacrifice will live forever. Let our enemies remember this day with terror. Let them speak of Croatian courage until the end of time. When they breach these gates, we attack. We will meet them with steel and fire, and when we fall, this fortress will become our tomb and theirs. For God, for Croatia, for eternal glory. The men responded with a thunderous war cry that reportedly made Ottoman soldiers pause in their advance. The gunpowder plot was an engineering marvel born of desperation. Croatian miners had spent weeks creating a network of channels beneath the castle's foundations. 3,000 pounds of gunpowder, every grain the defenders could spare from fighting, was distributed in clay pots and wooden barrels throughout these tunnels. But this wasn't random placement. The Croatian engineers, led by a master bombardier named Ivan Varga, had calculated blast patterns. They positioned the charges to create a shaped explosion that would direct force upward and outward. Iron nails, broken weapons, and stone fragments were packed around the powder to create massive shrapnel clouds. The triggering mechanism showed similar ingenuity. Multiple fuses of different lengths ensured that even if some failed, others would detonate the charges. Wounded soldiers who couldn't stand were positioned at key points with torches. Their final duty would be to ensure the explosion happened, even if the mobile defenders were overwhelmed too quickly. Most ingeniously, the Croatians had weakened certain walls deliberately, creating invitation points where Ottoman troops would naturally concentrate. These areas sat directly above the largest powder charges. At 3:50 p.m., the inner castle's gates suddenly burst open, but instead of surrender, out poured 600 Croatian warriors in their final charge. Zrinski led from the front, his silk doublet making him an obvious target. They didn't form defensive lines or seek cover. They attacked. The Ottoman troops, expecting desperate defense, were psychologically unprepared for this suicidal assault. The Croatians fought like men who had already accepted death, because they had. They threw themselves into the densest enemy formations, each man trying to kill as many as possible before falling. The charge split into three wings. The left, led by Zrinski's lieutenant Petar Pretacic, drove toward the Ottoman command posts. The right, under Franjo Crnko, the priest's brother, attacked the artillery positions. The center, with Zrinski himself, plunged straight into the massed janissaries. For 20 minutes, 600 men held their own against thousands through sheer fury. Wounded Croatians continued fighting on their knees. Men with mortal wounds used their last strength to grapple enemies, holding them for comrades to kill. The Ottoman dead piled up so fast they created obstacles for their own forces. At 4:07 p.m., the first fuse reached its powder charge. The initial blast came from beneath the main gate, where 500 pounds of gunpowder detonated. The stone archway launched skyward like a catapult shot, crushing dozens of Ottoman soldiers. Before the echo faded, the second charge exploded under the eastern wall. Then the third, then the fourth. In 7 seconds, Szigetvár ceased to exist as a coherent structure. Witnesses a mile away described a column of fire reaching toward heaven. The sound was beyond thunder, a physical force that burst eardrums and knocked men flat. The ground convulsed like an earthquake. Stone blocks the size of wagons flew through the air like leaves. But the horror came from what was mixed with the stones. Bodies and parts of bodies, Croatian and Ottoman alike, were hurled hundreds of feet. A rain of blood, flesh, and burning debris fell across a quarter-mile radius. Men simply vanished, vaporized at the explosion's center. Others were shredded by flying metal and stone fragments packed around the powder charges. The blast created a pressure wave that killed even those untouched by debris. Ottoman soldiers 100 yards from the castle walls were found dead with no visible wounds, their internal organs liquefied by the shock wave. The lucky ones died instantly. Others, trapped under rubble or impaled by flying debris, screamed for hours. When the smoke cleared, Szigetvár was gone. In its place stood a smoking crater surrounded by rubble mountains. The devastation defied comprehension. Ottoman military engineers later estimated that 3,000 of their soldiers died in the explosion itself. Another 2,000 were wounded so severely they died within days. The Croatian defenders achieved their goal. None survived to be captured. Of the 600 who made the final charge, perhaps a dozen bodies were found intact enough to identify. Count Zrinski's body, marked by his silk clothes and gold coins, was discovered 200 feet from where he'd been fighting, apparently thrown there by the blast. But in the Ottoman Sultan's tent, an even greater drama was unfolding. The explosion's shockwave reached the command post, knocking over screens and revealing what the Grand Vizier had desperately tried to hide. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had been dead for 3 days. The Battle of Szigetvár's aftermath changed European history in ways the participants never imagined. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha faced an impossible situation. The army's greatest victory had turned into a catastrophe. Their sultan was dead. Over 25,000 soldiers had died, taking a fortress that no longer existed. The march to Vienna was now impossible. The Grand Vizier's solution showed remarkable cunning. He maintained the fiction of Suleiman's survival for 3 more weeks, issuing orders in the dead sultan's name while racing back to Istanbul. Only when the army was safely in Ottoman territory was Suleiman's death announced. By then, the succession was secured, preventing the civil war that might have destroyed the empire. But the strategic damage was done. The Ottoman Empire never again mounted a serious threat to Vienna. The momentum of Ottoman expansion into Europe, building for 2 centuries, ended in a Croatian swamp. Military historians mark Szigetvár as the high watermark of Ottoman power in Europe. The final casualty figures tell the story's true cost. Of the 2,300 original Croatian defenders, only 7 survived, all wounded men who had been evacuated before the final battle. The Ottomans lost between 25,000 and 35,000 soldiers, more than 10 times the entire Croatian garrison. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, one of history's greatest conquerors, died watching a minor fortress that should have fallen in days. European reaction was mixed. While church bells rang celebrating the Ottoman retreat, the Habsburg Emperor's abandonment of Szigetvár created lasting bitterness. Croatian nobility never forgave Maximilian II for sacrificing their greatest hero. The phrase, "we were sold out at Szigetvár," became a Croatian expression for betrayal that persists today. Modern archaeological excavations have confirmed the battle's devastating scale. The crater from the explosion is still visible. Excavations routinely uncover Ottoman cannonballs, Croatian weapons, and human remains. In 2016, on the battle's 450th anniversary, ground-penetrating radar revealed the tunnel system used for the gunpowder plot, exactly where Croatian accounts placed them. But numbers and artifacts can't capture Szigetvár's true significance. This was the moment when the medieval concept of honorable surrender died. Zrinski and his men invented a new form of warfare, defensive martyrdom, where victory meant taking as many enemies as possible into death. Their example inspired desperate defenders for centuries afterward. The Ottoman Empire learned a hard lesson about the price of conquest. A territory defended by men willing to turn themselves into weapons couldn't be held. The psychological impact rippled through Ottoman military doctrine. Never again did they assume a surrounded fortress would simply surrender. Count Nikola Zrinski entered history as the Leonidas of Croatia. His sacrifice became legend, inspiring national poetry, operas, and monuments. But unlike Thermopylae's heroic defeat, Szigetvár achieved its strategic goal. The Ottomans retreated, Vienna remained free, Christian Europe survived. In the end, 2,300 Croatian soldiers accomplished what Habsburg armies couldn't. They stopped the Ottoman Empire's advance. They paid the ultimate price, turning their fortress into a weapon and their deaths into victory. When surrender meant survival, they chose death and became immortal. The mathematics were simple. 600 men who chose to become a bomb saved a civilization.